Good evening, friends. Welcome to my channel where we explore the hidden histories of New England. Tonight, we begin our retelling of The Crucible by Arthur Miller with a look at Chapter 1, the opening scene. In about 1 minute, I'm going to set the stage for this drama by looking at the history of the village that is home to this story, and then I'll read the chapter to you. So if you're ready, let's get started. The year is 1692, and the place is Salem Village, now called Danvers, Mass. The sun has set, and the only light in the sky comes from the sliver of a moon. The air is still and quiet. There's a hush over the village, a blanket of quiet that hangs heavy and thick. It's a cold night, too, and the windows of the small wooden houses are shuttered tight against the evening chill. Inside those houses, though, there is light. Lanterns flickered beside beds and over wooden tables, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the smell of wood smoke drifts through cracks in the window frames, mixing with the aroma of porridge and stew. A young girl stirs in her sleep, her nightmare causing her to whimper out loud, but no one else stirs. It's a quiet village, asleep under the watchful eye of God. Most of these houses were built by farmers who fled here from the Massachusetts Bay Colony to the north to escape what they saw as the growing corruption of that society. They were Puritans, members of a Protestant sect that believed in the worship of God through hard work and good works. They came here to build a new godly life. Their houses were built close to the road. No grand estates were allowed in this village. Every house looked the same, a simple wooden structure, each window pane nailed shut, every door locked tight. This was not a village made for leisure. They did not come here to enjoy the land, but to tame it in the name of God. There was no time for games or gossip. Life was serious. Even their minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, lived in a small, unadorned house, just like the rest of them. He didn't even have a horse to ride upon. It was an isolated life, a solitary existence, far from any other settlements. If they needed supplies, they had to travel 4 days down dusty roads to reach the nearest merchant. The winters were long and harsh, and snow would pile up against the shutters, sealing them in their homes for weeks at a time. They couldn't rely on the soil, either. At first, the crops had flourished here, but now wolves were eating the corn before it could be gathered in, and the cows were giving little milk. Sickness, too, took its toll on the people. Their isolation meant that when disease struck, there was no doctor to call. Sometimes the only sound that cut through the heavy quiet was the scream of someone in pain, and all the while, lurking in the shadows, waiting in the darkness, was the devil. That's what the people told themselves when strange things happened. When doors opened on their own, or trees seemed to bend toward the road, they knew it was the devil. For years, the devil had been stirring among them, tempting them with nightmares, whispering to them in the darkness, trying to break them. And some were weaker than others. It wasn't enough for them to live their lives in fear. They wanted more. They needed more. So they turned to God, as I said. This was a community bound together by their Puritan faith. But that faith was starting to fray around the edges. And where the light of faith flickers, the darkness creeps in. From the very first paragraph of the play, Miller sets the tone for what is to come. The reader is immediately enveloped in the hushed quiet of the village, as if standing right there in the stillness, feeling the weight of the silence. Then, with the mention of the moon, we know the time is late. We can feel the chill of the night air seeping into our bones. Miller doesn't hold back. He drops us right into the middle of the action. In a world where every detail matters, we learn that there's no light pollution here. So the stars shine bright overhead, and there's no gaslight or electric lights to cast a yellow glow on the cobblestones. Instead, lanterns flicker, casting dancing shadows on the wall, reminding us that we are in a world without modern conveniences. These people are poor and isolated. They don't even have a doctor. They're living without many of the comforts of modern life, and yet their biggest fear is not hunger, cold, or loneliness, but rather the devil. That should tell us everything we need to know about the kind of world these people inhabit. Their greatest enemy is not in their midst. He's outside it, lurking in the darkness, trying to slip inside. And now, with that, we are ready to start. As the playwright, Arthur Miller, tells us, here come some people. Who are they? What do they want? Why are they walking about on a night like this? Let's find out. Characters in order of appearance: Reverend Samuel Parris, Thomas Putnam, his wife, Anne Putnam, and their daughter, Ruth, Rebecca Nurse, and the nurse's niece. Abigail Williams, enter Reverend Parris, his 2 daughters, and Anne Putnam. Reverend Parris walks with a limp, clutching a book in his hand. His oldest daughter, Abigail, follows behind him, skipping lightly. His youngest, Ruth, lags far behind, dragging her feet. They entered the Putnam house. Now Miller wastes no time introducing us to the first character, the Reverend Samuel Parris. He's important because he's the minister of Salem Village, and in the 18th century, the minister was the most respected member of any community. He was seen as an instrument of God, and his word carried great weight. Miller tells us right away that Parris is afraid. He clutches a book to his chest as he walks, and speaks quickly in a low voice. Parris is also weak. He hobbles along with a limp, and must lean on his cane for support. With these physical ailments, Miller is telling us that this man is not strong. His body is broken and his mind is scattered. And since he's the spiritual leader of this town, that does not bode well for them. Abigail's quite different from her father. She skips ahead of him and seems carefree. Here, Miller lets us know that she's not much older than a child herself, but he also hints that she may be more cunning than her father. She's also quick to anger. Later in the play, we'll see how she accuses people of witchcraft and stands firm in her accusations. Unlike her father, Abigail is physically strong. She's not afraid to accuse the most powerful men and women in the village of witchcraft. She's brave, perhaps recklessly so. But what about Ruth? She trails behind the others, dragging her feet, and seems to lack energy. Is she tired? Is she depressed? Does she spend her days gossiping and her nights stirring up trouble? Or is she sick? Here, Miller gives us a hint that something is wrong with her. Could this be the cause of the strange happenings in the village? Are the villagers right to blame her? We don't know yet, but we will soon. Anne Putnam and her husband, Thomas, are characters we won't see much of in this scene, but they'll become more prominent later. Like Parris, they're worried about their children. In fact, they're worried about nothing more than the safety of their offspring. And for good reason. As we'll see later, they suffer more than anyone in the play. They're bound together by their worries and will do anything to protect their children. Finally, we meet Rebecca Nurse and her niece, Abigail Williams. Rebecca is an adult, sensible and calm, a pillar of the community. She's always willing to help her neighbors, and is known for her piety and common sense. Her niece, Abigail, is somewhat different. She's headstrong, quick to anger, and has a sharp tongue. She's not afraid to speak her mind, which gets her into trouble later. The stage directions tell us that Abigail and Rebecca Nurse walk side by side, so they must be close. Perhaps Rebecca is responsible for watching over Abigail. That makes me wonder, why does Abigail need someone to look after her? What kind of person is she? And now, as the scene begins, we hear Abigail speaking. She's talking about the strange things that have been happening in the village. Things have been out of sorts for a while now, but recently, strange things have been happening. People are acting strangely, animals are dying, and there's a general sense of unease in the village. Abigail is the first to speak up and say something must be done to stop it. But what exactly is happening? Well, that's what this play is about. And as the characters begin to talk, we start to learn the answer. And that's it for this episode. Join us next time as we continue our journey back to 1692, Salem Village. And remember, if you like what we do, please support us through the provided means. Until then, take care. This is the second episode in our series on the Salem Witch Trials. You can find links to all of our episodes in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more historical tales like this one. Chapter 2. Life in Salem. Faith, fear, and isolation, in order to understand the events that transpired in Salem, Massachusetts. In 1692, we have to first explore what life was like there. Let's take a walk through Salem Village with the main character from our previous episode. When the settlers of Salem Village arrived in the 1640s, they found themselves in an unsettled and unfamiliar land, alone except for the indigenous peoples who had lived there for centuries. The settlers' strong belief in the power of the devil meant that they believed they were under constant threat from malevolent forces. Their fears were only heightened by the knowledge that the land they now occupied had once been the home of people whose religion they considered to be in league with the devil. As part of their religious doctrine, Puritans believed in predestination, which held that God had already decided who would be saved and who would be damned. This made living a good Christian life very important, because the only way a person could prove that they were among the elect was by living a life that demonstrated godliness. But at the same time, it instilled a great deal of fear, since any sinful behavior could be interpreted as evidence that someone was not, in fact, among the elect. Members of the community kept a close eye on each other to make sure no one was leading others away from God. The Puritans also brought with them a deep-rooted suspicion of nature, believing that the wilderness was full of temptation and evil. Some even believed that the wilderness itself might try to reclaim what was once theirs. As one minister put it, the face of things in the wild and uncultivated state of the land appears terrible and discouraging. To early New Englanders, the primeval forest was an untamed and chaotic place that was best avoided. In such an environment, it was easy to see threatening presences around every bend or hear spectral figures rustling in the underbrush. The New England landscape itself inspired fear. Further adding to the prevailing air of paranoia, the settlers of Salem Village and Salem Town had long been politically at odds. Salem Village, where our story is set, was originally incorporated into the town of Salem, which sat about 8 miles south. Over time, the two areas became increasingly frustrated with one another. Salem Village residents felt that the town council was unpaying enough attention to their concerns, and that the tax burden placed on them by the town government was unfair. So in 1686, they petitioned to break away and become their own municipality, which was eventually granted. Life in Colonial, Massachusetts was hard. The climate was cold and winters were harsh. Food could often be scarce and illness spread easily, and when disease did strike, there was little understanding of its causes or effective treatments. If the victim was afflicted with something like smallpox, there's a good chance they wouldn't survive. Even a simple fever could quickly turn deadly. Medical practice in the colonies was still largely dominated by humoral theory, which held that the human body contained 4 humors, or fluids: blood, phlegm, black, and yellow bile. A person needed to have the right balance of these humors in order to be in good health. If the humors were out of balance, the person would become ill. Treatments for illnesses were designed to restore balance by removing one of the humors, often by inducing vomiting or diarrhea. But these practices only made patients sicker and prolonged their suffering. Compounding these difficulties was a lack of medical training. Most practitioners were not formally educated in medicine. They simply had some knowledge passed down from previous practitioners or gained through experience. Not only were most people wary of physicians, but many people thought it was a sin to use medicine to cure ailments, since it could interfere with God's plan. At the time, people also believed that witches could inflict illnesses on others, and so a person suffering from an illness like smallpox or consumption, tuberculosis, could easily be accused of being afflicted by a curse. Within this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, the stage was set for tragedy. When our story begins in February of 1692, the village of Salem had been experiencing a harsh winter and a scarcity of food. Though technically independent, Salem Village was still closely connected to Salem Town and was dependent on its economic activity. For many years, trade between Salem Town and the village had been conducted on credit, with merchants expecting payment when the harvest came in. But the recent harsh winter had damaged the crops and destroyed the fishing fleet, meaning that the villages would be unable to repay their debts. This left them vulnerable to the whims of the Salem Town merchants, who were beginning to grow impatient. Since the village couldn't afford to pay off their debt, the selectmen decided to call for an extraordinary town meeting in order to raise funds. It was at this meeting that Reverend Samuel Paris began to notice strange behavior in his daughter Betty and niece, Abigail. Reverend Paris had come to Salem Village just 3 months earlier, having been summoned by the congregation to replace their former pastor, Reverend George Burroughs, who had died after contracting smallpox. The Parises were newcomers to the tight-knit community, and had yet to win over its members. Reverend Paris was considered to be arrogant and self-important, and was suspicious of the congregation, believing them to be gossipy and judgmental. In turn, many members of the church found him to be pompous and disliked his sermons. Many thought he preached too much about the dangers of witchcraft and the devil, which only served to make him seem out of touch. On the night of February, Reverend Paris awoke to find Betty and Abigail screaming in terror. They claimed that they were under attack by unseen assailants. Reverend Paris rushed to their aid, but he, too, soon found himself the victim of invisible attacks. As the weeks passed, more and more young people came forward with similar claims. At first, the adults tried to dismiss their stories as the product of overactive imaginations, or the effects of reading ghost stories. But as the number of accusers grew, the idea that there might actually be a more rational explanation became less and less tenable. Soon, the afflicted girls were having fits in public, contorting themselves in ways that seemed to defy explanation. As the community watched in horror, they knew they were witnessing something unnatural. By March, several men and women had come forward to claim that they, too, had been attacked by the devil and his followers. All of those accused were respectable members of society who had been personally known by most of the townspeople for years, and so the possibility that they were lying to cover up some personal shame or embarrassment was remote. At this point, the town began to take the accusations seriously and formed a committee to investigate. However, as the committee began to question the accusers, it became clear that they knew nothing about what was happening. Those afflicted had no idea who was attacking them or why, and what's worse, they had no idea how to stop the attacks. The situation was desperate. Salem Village had no trained physician, and so they sent for John Halley, a minister from nearby Lynn who had written a book on the subject of witchcraft. Halley, along with 2 other ministers, visited the afflicted and came to the conclusion that they were indeed victims of supernatural forces. Shortly thereafter, the town meeting turned the investigation over to a group of 5 men and set them to the task of finding the sources of the evil afflicting the village. Those responsible for investigating the case quickly hit a wall. The accusers were unable to identify their attackers, and without names, the men had no leads. Unable to determine the source of the problem, they turned to what they knew best. Superstition. What they lacked in logic and reason, they made up for in fear and intuition. And so it was that in the superstitious minds of Salem Village, the perfect storm of fear, isolation, and suspicion led to tragedy. Fear of the devil and the belief that he tempted humans at every turn created an atmosphere of paranoia. Fear of the wilderness and its supposed evil meant that the villagers were isolated from the rest of the world, and fear of one another made it easy for rumors to spread and for accusations to fly. If you enjoyed this episode, then check out our other historical dailies, including our podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Salem, Massachusetts. 1692. Reverend Samuel Paris was having a terrible week. First, his daughter Betty had fallen ill, and then his niece Abigail Williams came over for a visit and she got sick too. Now both girls were having strange fits. They were crying out in the middle of the night, screaming in ways that no one could explain. There was only one problem. Dr. William Griggs couldn't find anything wrong with them. So now everyone in town was whispering about witchcraft. Welcome to Chapter 3 of Oyer and Terminer, the Salem Witch Trials. If you're new here, welcome. It is January 1692, and we are bringing you this 11-part series on the Salem Witch Trials every Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. As always, be sure to check out our social media pages to learn more about the series, and to learn more about each of these incredible people whose stories are being lost to history. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now, let's go back to the story. Let me introduce you to Reverend Samuel Paris. He's a well-respected minister, and he lives with his wife, Elizabeth, their daughter Betty, and their slave teacher. This is not a happy home. However, Elizabeth has recently died, and there is tension between the 2 sisters. At least, there will be soon. You see, Samuel is going to marry a woman named Margaret Scott, who he has been having an affair with, and when his current wife, Elizabeth, finds out about this, she really isn't too happy about it. In fact, she even writes Margaret a letter, threatening her. One day, Samuel announces his engagement to Margaret and tells his daughter, Betty, that he is going to take his new bride to live with him in the home they've built for Elizabeth. Betty doesn't like this at all. She's angry that her father would replace her mother so quickly, and she's also upset that Margaret will move into her bedroom. So Betty and her cousin Abigail Williams decide that they were going to put a curse on the new bride. And how do they know it's worked? Well, shortly after Samuel announces his engagement, Betty comes down with a fever. She's delirious and makes no sense whatsoever. One day, She starts screaming that Tituba's trying to kill her by witchcraft, and she even tries to stab the poor slave girl. When Tituba cries out that she's innocent, Betty stops screaming and calms down until the next time she has a fit. She accused Tituba again, but then stops when the poor girl cries out that she's innocent. In the meantime, Betty's cousin, Abigail Williams, has come to stay with the family for a while, and she, too, has started having fits. We'll get more into Abigail's story later. For now, we'll just say that she's a troubled girl who has had a difficult life. Her father left her and her mother and went to live with another woman, and then her mother died shortly thereafter. Abigail has been living with her uncle, Reverend Paris, ever since. One night, Betty and Abigail are in bed together when they both start screaming in the middle of the night. Their screams wake up Reverend Paris, who rushes into the room to find his daughter convulsing in her bed. He feels for a pulse, but his fingers can't find a heartbeat. Betty gasps for air and her eyes roll back in her head. Her whole body is shaking and she is biting her tongue so hard that blood is coming out of her mouth. Just when it seems like Betty might die, she suddenly goes still. She's pale and she's sweating, but she's alive. The next morning, Reverend Paris calls the local doctor, William Griggs, to come examine his daughter. But when the doctor arrives, he can't find anything wrong with her. This happens several times over the course of a few weeks, and Dr. Griggs is completely baffled. Betty is always able to tell him what happened during her fits, though. She says that the fits come in the night, and she has no control over them. She says they feel like a weight is pressing on her chest, making it hard for her to breathe. She says that she feels like there are people sitting on her bed, pushing down on her, and she can hear a buzzing sound in her ears. That's why she screams and she bites her tongue and she kicks and she scratches. As the weeks pass, Betty's behavior becomes more and more erratic. She has no energy and she spends most of her days sleeping. She doesn't want to eat and she loses a significant amount of weight. She has black, sunken eyes, and her skin is clammy and cold. She is clearly not well, but Dr. Griggs insists that he can find nothing wrong with her. Finally, Reverend Paris decides that his daughter needs a change of scenery, and he sends her to live with her cousin Abigail Williams and her family in the village of Salem Town. When Betty arrives, she has another fit, but she's able to control it and stop herself from screaming. She looks better after this, and she begins to act more like her old self. Unfortunately, she's not well enough to make the trip back home, so she stays with the Putnam family for the time being. A few days after Betty leaves, Reverend Paris goes to visit her. He arrives at the house and asks if he can come in, but when he knocks on the door, he hears a blood-curdling scream. He rushes inside and finds Abigail lying on the floor in a fit. She's thrashing around. Her eyes are rolled back in her head, and she's foaming at the mouth. He feels for a pulse and turns her head to try to make her spit up the blood that's coming out of her mouth. Eventually, she stops screaming, and she falls still on the floor. When she comes to, she looks at Reverend Paris and begs him to forgive her because she knows she has done something terrible. She doesn't know what came over her. She says she must have been possessed by the devil. She must have been bewitched. Reverend Paris is horrified. What is happening to these children? How can he help them? And how can he protect them from whatever evil force is out to get them? Well, that's it for this episode. As always, remember to join us tomorrow for the next chapter of our series, The Salem Witch Trials. And if you'd like to learn more about what happened to these incredible people whose stories are being lost to history, be sure to check out our social media pages. Until next time, remember, if you stare long enough into the abyss will stare back. Welcome to Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692. It's me, and this is episode 3, chapter 4 of The Witch of Blackbird Pond, where we bring you the true story of the Salem Witch Trials. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth at the Proctor home, but no one inside took much notice. Their minds were miles away, or at least as far as they could imagine. Reverend Samuel Paris, his daughter, Elizabeth, and several members of the Paris household sat in silence, staring into the dancing flames. Each was lost in their own thoughts, consumed by the strange fit that had struck little Abigail Williams. Only moments before, they had all witnessed it. At first, there was only a slight twitching of the girl's arm, followed by a violent jerking of her entire body. Then she began to scream, not in pain, but in terror. Her face contorted with fear as she cried out, "Oh God, help me. A black woman is choking me." Then, just as suddenly as it began, The fit was over, and now they sat in silence. As the minutes ticked by, Abigail grew calmer. She sat up slowly, looked around at their fearful faces, and smiled wickedly. This wasn't the first time she'd had such a fit, nor would it be the last. And she knew exactly what effect it had on people. But despite their fear, Reverend Parris could unhelp but feel a twinge of pride at the thought that his daughter was so spiritually attuned that she could call down the very presence of Satan himself. He cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice. "A black woman, did you say? Perhaps one of those heathen wenches Titaba has conjured up." Titaba, also known as Old Titty, was the enslaved woman of color who cooked and cleaned for the Parris family. She had been a gift to Reverend Parris from the wealthy family she served in Barbados, and he brought her with him when he moved to Salem. There was little that Titaba loved more than telling stories of her native land, tales of magic and mystery that both fascinated and frightened the Puritan children. Reverend Parris often warned her to stop frightening the young ones with such heathen talk, but it was hard for Titaba to know when she was being too scary and when she was just telling a story. When she was young, these same stories had been told to her by her grandmother in the Caribbean. Stories about spirits and witchcraft had always seemed like fun to In fact, she sometimes even participated in the rituals that her grandmother and the other women performed. Back then, it had never occurred to Titaba that magic was real, any more than it had ever occurred to her that she might one day be accused of being a witch. In the quiet house, the words echoed ominously in the silence. A black woman Titaba, one of those heathen wenches. Those words stabbed at her heart like a knife. All of the times that she'd told stories and accidentally frightened the children. All of the herbal remedies she'd suggested and administered. All of the prayers she'd offered up to the spirits of her ancestors. Every bit of traditional island life that she shared with the children all came back to haunt her now. What if they believed those stories? What if they believed that she really did conjure up evil spirits? What if they believed that she was a witch? Suddenly, Reverend Parris was standing up, his eyes blazing. "That's enough," he thundered, slamming his fist on the table. "We've heard enough of your lies and foolishness. Come along now, girl, and let us question you." Titaba tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mind was racing. What were they talking about? Hadn't they just been discussing Abigail's fit? How could they turn on her like this? Before she could answer, Reverend Parris grabbed her roughly by the arm and pulled her toward the door. "Come along now, gal," he said again, "and don't think for a minute that you can trick us. We know you're one of them." They led her through the dark house and out into the night. A chilled wind whipped around them, rustling the leaves overhead and sending shivers down her spine. As they walked, she heard the murmur of other voices calling out in the darkness. Soon, they arrived at the meeting house, where the Reverend Parris released her into the crowd of waiting townspeople. A hush fell over the group as they turned to stare at her, their faces grim and accusing. "Titaba," asked Reverend Parris loudly, so that everyone could hear, "what have you done?" Titaba's mind was still reeling from the sudden accusation. She hadn't done anything. She didn't know what they were talking about, but as she looked out over the sea of angry faces, she realized that she didn't have to tell them anything. Not one person there cared whether she was guilty or not. They wanted to believe that there were witches in their midst, and they were going to find someone to blame. So why not make it easy on herself? Why not admit to the accusations and get it over with? And so, Titaba began her tale. She admitted to all manner of witchcraft. She named imaginary accomplices. She confessed to traveling to the Caribbean on broomsticks and conversing with demons. Anything to make the townspeople happy and end this charade. She told them everything they wanted to hear and more. She described how she had met the devil at a nearby hill called the Ledge, where he appeared to her in the form of a tall, handsome man. She went into great detail, describing his piercing blue eyes, his lush red hair and flowing white robes, and she finished her tale with a flourish, saying that he promised her power beyond her wildest dreams. If she would only agree to serve him, that was all they wanted to hear. The rest didn't matter. And so the next morning, when Titaba, along with 2 other women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, were brought before the Salem meeting house for their first official hearing, the jury had already made up their minds. For the next 2 days, the court listened as Taiba repeated her story, and while some details changed, the core remained the same. The other two women accused her of conspiring with them to raise up Satan and worship him. And while Titaba insisted that she did not know the other two women very well, she admitted to having attended one meeting with them on the Sabbath. She also admitted to making a pact with the devil at the ledge and serving as his enforcer in the town, putting curses on people and causing them harm. Titeba had done everything she could to protect herself the night before, naming imaginary accomplices and conjuring up a terrifying tale of the devil himself. But here it was coming back to haunt her. She had painted such a vivid picture of the devil at the ledge that the townspeople immediately sent a search party to the hill to look for evidence, and there they found the remnants of a fire pit in a circle of stones, which the townspeople quickly identified as a meeting place for witches. Suddenly, the only thing that separated Titaba from her imaginary accomplices was a lack of physical evidence. But the court wasn't interested in evidence. They had heard enough, and without even deliberating, they returned a guilty verdict against Titaba and the two separated. Now Titaba shuddered as the weight of her confession pressed down on her. She knew she was doomed. Despite her attempts to save herself, the court saw to it that she was taken straight from the courthouse to Bridewell, where she would await her punishment. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, she slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands. Alone, at last Titaba wept for herself and for the others, knowing that they would soon face the same grim fate. But she had done all of this to protect herself. Now they would pay the price. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe for more episodes each week. Also check out our site for news, updates, and more. Next week, we will continue the story in episode 4, chapter 5, where we will learn that Bridget Bishop becomes the first woman to be tried and executed as a witch in Salem. See you next time. Villagers were standing in their fields that day watching the police drag my brother away. Some were openly weeping. Others had this shocked, disbelieving look on their faces. And some, well, they just looked pleased with themselves. But the person who was watching from his house, the person whose cold had brought the police, he wasn't there. He didn't show himself. That day, not one person spoke to me or asked me any questions. Everyone seemed to know what had happened, except me. The silence was deafening. It was sighing, we don't want to know. We don't want anything to do with you. This isn't the first time I've seen such behavior, but I did expect better from these people. After all, they had been our friends. They had been our neighbors for generations. So why did they turn their back on us like that? I got my answer soon enough. When the funeral procession arrived, no one came out to pay their respects. Not even the children. As far as they were concerned, we were a said. In fact, that's what they started calling us. The cursed family. The stench of death clung to our clothes, our skin, our very beings. It made them uncomfortable. That's when I knew that our problems had gone beyond our own doing. Someone in the village had poisoned their minds against us. But who? Why? In the days that followed, I couldn't get a straight answer to either of those questions. It was always the same story. Some excuse about respecting the privacy of the deceased family. Some other lie about not knowing anything. No one wanted to speak to me. Even Mangala, who had once called me her best friend, turned her back on me. She also stopped coming to our house for dinner. Sometimes I would spot her by the window and quickly drop the newspaper I was holding, so she would unsee me reading. The only person who stood by me was Dottie. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, she, too, started looking haggard. It was as if the entire village had become one big tumor feeding off our pain. No, I wasn't going to let them win. I refused to be cowed down. I decided to find out who was behind all of this. I wanted to confront them and ask them why they were doing this to us. So I started going around the village, asking every single person, the baker, the butcher, the school teacher, the grocer, everyone. But I didn't get anywhere. Each person told me they knew nothing, that they weren't speaking to us because they respected our grief. I was starting to feel helpless when I remembered my father's words. He had once told me that if you can't find the solution here, sometimes it's best to look at things from a distance. You gain a lot of clarity that way. It's an old saying, but I really liked it, and I felt it was time to take my father's advice. I picked up and called my friend Gopal. He lived in Jaipur. I told him about everything that had happened. and then I asked him if he could come over for a few days. Well, he not only came, he stayed on for 2 weeks. Together we tried to figure out who was behind all this. Now my first thought went to Harikishan. My brother and he had had a huge fight a few days before the incident. In fact, Harikishan had even filed a police complaint against my brother, accusing him of trespassing and misbehaving with his wife. We had strong evidence to prove our innocence, but Harikishan refused to listen. So we decided to sue him. Could this be his revenge? Could he have killed my brother to take his revenge? Gopal and I visited Harikishan's house, but he wasn't there. His wife opened the door and we asked her where her husband was. She replied curtly that we had no right to question her husband. She was suspicious of us. She kept throwing dagger looks at me. And to be honest, I was feeling a little scared. When Harikishan returned home, Gopal and I confronted him. We asked him point blank if he had something to do with Akasha's death. He laughed at us. Then he threw us out of his house and locked the door from inside. At that point, I felt as if our suspicions were correct. But Gopal held back. He said maybe we should give him the benefit of doubt, that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. I argued with him, but he wouldn't budge. Then he told me we needed a concrete reason, hard evidence to file a police complaint. But I was tired of running around and filing complaints. Moreover, I was getting late. My daughter was due any time now. As we walked past the field, Gopal stopped me. He pointed towards the crops and said, "Look, the cucumbers are missing from the field." He said maybe it would be better if we checked the CCTV footage from the security camera installed near Harikishan's field. Just then, I saw a familiar face. It was Mangla's husband, Ramesh. He was entering Harikishan's field. I asked Gopal to keep an eye on Ramesh while I followed him. Ramesh walked into the shed behind Harikishan's house. I stood outside listening intently. What I heard next left me shocked. Ramesh was saying, "Harikishan, what proof do you need? We all saw the boy go inside your field. We all know what happened next. The boy must have realized that we had found out his crime. That's why he ran away. But if the police come and ask you questions, you must tell them what happened. You must tell them the whole truth. If you don't, they won't spare you." So I was right. Ramesh was the one who had killed my brother. But why? Why did he kill my brother? He wasn't even involved in the dispute. Well, the answer to that was simple. Ramesh was Harikishan's nephew. Blood was thicker than water for him. Their loyalty to each other, to their own blood, was stronger than the laws of the country. But why had they framed the entire village against us? Was it just to save themselves? To put the blame on someone else? The answer to that was much simpler. They were scared. Scared of being punished for what they had done. Scared of what they had witnessed. And I was scared too. Scared that this incident had destroyed our family. Our reputation was tarnished. Who would want to be associated with us? My father would be turning in his grave. My mother would be weeping. All my childhood dreams, ambitions, all my hopes and aspirations, they were crushed under the weight of the crime. But the most disturbing part was that none of this had happened in isolation. How many people knew about it? Who all had witnessed it? These questions tormented me. Then one evening, as I was sitting in the courtyard, a new face entered our lane. He introduced himself as Inspector Vikram Singh. He was a young man, probably in his mid-20s. He was investigating my brother's death. He sat down next to me and said, "Ma'am, I want to ask you a few questions." I nodded. He asked me if I suspected anyone. I told him, yes, a few. I told him about Harikishan and his wife. The inspector took notes. Then he asked me about Ramesh Mangala's husband. I told him I saw him enter in Harikishan's house that morning. Inspector Singh nodded. He said, "Thank you. That will be all for today. Ma'am, I'll contact you if I need anything else." He left. The next day, he came again. He grilled us about everything. He also asked us if we had noticed any suspicious movement in the village that evening. We hadn't. Then the inspector asked us if we had noticed anyone leaving the village that morning. But we hadn't. But as he was leaving, I called him back and I told him I had seen someone. I told him about Ramesh. He thanked me and left. The next day, the inspector came back with a team of policemen. He went to Harikishan's house and started searching it. Meanwhile, another team went to Ramesh's house. Both men were arrested. The inspector then came to my house and told me that he had found a few important pieces of evidence against them. For starters, the post-mortem report. According to the report, my brother was hit on the head with a heavy object. It could be a hockey stick or a cricket bat. Then he showed me the footage from the security camera. It clearly showed Ramesh entering Harikishan's field, after which a scuffle broke out. The rest of the footage was blurred. After that, the inspector left. One day he returned to tell me that both Harikishan and Ramesh had confessed to the crime. According to them, they had gone to the field to relieve themselves when my brother entered the field. They confronted him. My brother lost his temper and started abusing them. Then they got into a scuffle. In a fit of rage, Harikishan hit my brother on the head. Ramesh panicked. He didn't know what to do. So, they ran. Ow. They buried my brother's body in the field so that no one would find out. The inspector asked me what I thought about the story. I told him I thought it was a lie, but he said they had enough evidence against the two men, so they would have to let them off. I understood that it was pointless arguing with him, so I agreed. But I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. If Ramesh and Harikishan had killed my brother in a fit of rage, then why had they tried so hard to frame the entire village against us? Hadn't they confessed? Why were they trying to implicate others? Meanwhile, the news of my brother's murder spread like wildfire. People started talking in hushed tones about it. At first, I hated all the pitying glances, the sympathetic murmurs, but slowly, I started feeling grateful for them. At least now I knew I wasn't alone. At least now I had answers to my questions. It was then that I realized this story is not about a village divided over a dead body. This story is about a village divided over the truth. Salem Village, Massachusetts, May 1692. The first official hearing of the accused witches took place today in the Salem meet. Reverend Parris's pulpit was taken down so that it could be used as a makeshift trial bench. The room was crowded with people, making it hard for the judges to see and hear anything. The prisoners were paraded into the room in their prison clothes and made to stand before the bench, while the ministers read through the charges against them. All pleaded not guilty. Titaba readily confessed to being a witch, but when she turned on her accusers, calling Reverend Parris a witch and saying he had bewitched her, the girls fell down before the court in hysterics. This testimony was enough to convict Titaba and the two servants, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. But what does it mean? How can a minister be a witch? Is this really the work of the devil? Why are they using spectral evidence? How is this going to end? Welcome to episode 4 of the Salem Witch Trials, in which we break down each of the events of 1690 one by one to better understand how we got to the infamous climax of 1693 and 1694. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date on all things witch trials. On May, the 3 accused witches were tried in a special court session held in the Salem meeting. In preparation for the trial, George Burroughs, one of the men accused, wrote a letter to the magistrates pleading his innocence. He told them that he had heard rumors about the accusations being made against him and wanted to know who was behind them. In his letter he said, "Whereas there have been some late reports of my being a witch, I must let you know that the very thoughts are so contrary to my nature that my very heart and soul do abhor the same." His pleas fell on deaf ears and he was convicted. But why exactly were these hearings even taking place? The court was convened by order of the General Court on April. It was made up of 3 judges: William Stoughton, Atana, from Topsfield; John Hathorne, judge, who would later come to regret his decision to sit on the panel; and Francis Phipps, who at 26 years old became the youngest person ever to serve as Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Phipps was chosen because Governor Prentice refused to swear an oath to the court. The new court sat right in the middle of the village, where everyone could see it and hear it. The structure wasn't much of a courtroom. Instead, a part of the meeting house was cleared out for the proceedings. The judges sat on a raised platform that was normally occupied by Reverend Parris's pulpit. The prisoners stood before them in their prison clothes, while the ministers read through the charges against them. After the charges were read, the prisoners were asked how they pleaded. All 3, including Titaba, the Native American slave belonging to Reverend Parris, pleaded not guilty. Titaba, however, readily confessed to being a witch and named several people in the community as witches as well. She even accused Reverend Parris of being a witch and said that he had bewitched her. At that, the girls fell down before the court in hysterics, and the court decided that Tituba's testimony was enough to convict her and the two other women who had also pleaded not guilty, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Osborne had been accused by the girls of hurting them by throwing fits and by choking them in their sleep. And Good had been accused by the girls and by Rebecca Nurse, a pillar of the community, of afflicting the children and calling them the devil's spawn. Tituba's testimony that Reverend Paris had bewitched her, however, threw the court for a loop. At the time, it was believed that only an innocent person could be the victim of witchcraft. And since Reverend Paris was a man of the cloth, he couldn't possibly be a witch. So then the court needed to find a way to reconcile Tituba's accusation that Reverend Paris had forced her into witchcraft with the fact that he was obviously a good Christian man. This is where the concept of spectral evidence started to become a problem. Spectral evidence consisted of visions or dreams of spirits that were usually given in court to show proof of witchcraft. This type of evidence was incredibly popular among the Puritans, but it was never formally recognized by the courts as valid evidence. The Bible had very little to say about witchcraft, and so many of the laws and rules governing it were created by Puritan leaders based on their own personal beliefs. They didn't want to outright ban the use of spectral evidence, because many times it was the only kind of evidence that they had. However, they did try to minimize its use whenever possible. Unfortunately for the accused witches, there were no formal guidelines set up for the use of this type of evidence, so any and all claims of seeing, hearing, or feeling the spirit of a witch were taken seriously by the court. The court reconvened on May and June to hear more evidence against the three accused. On June, Martha Carrier was added to the list of those accused, along with her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Howe. Carrier was accused by the girls of having thrown fits and choked them while they slept, just as Sarah Osborne had been accused. Howe was accused of doing the same thing and was also accused of afflicting the children by pricking them with needles. That day, the court heard from several witnesses, including Reverend Paris, who testified that Tituba had said that he had bewitched her, causing her to become a witch. In addition, he said that Tituba had said that she had seen Martha Carrier at the Devil's party in the forest. This was the first time that a grand jury had met outside of Boston, and after only a few hours of deliberation, Martha Carrier, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba were indicted. The grand jury even indicted George Burroughs, despite the fact that he had not yet been brought before the court. The court reconvened on June to hear additional evidence against the 5 accused witches. When it came time for Elizabeth Howe's trial, the presiding judge, Thomas Phipps, left the bench to speak to her privately. He told her that she could plead guilty to being a witch and receive a light sentence, or she could plead not guilty and face the death penalty. Naturally, she chose to plead not guilty. However, Phipps then told her that he already knew she was guilty and proceeded to convict her. He also convicted Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, but he allowed Martha Carrier and Tituba to go free after they confessed to being witches. With the first trials complete, pressure was mounting on the accused to confess. Many of the accused felt that their only chance at avoiding execution was to agree to confess to witchcraft. Even though confessions would not absolve them of their punishment, they hoped that by confessing they would be sentenced to prison rather than death. As we will see next time, this is not how it worked out. In the meantime, there are plenty of ways that you can help support this channel and bring early modern history to more people like yourself. Our supporters also get access to a podcast, a blooper reel, and the power to suggest ideas for future episodes. As always, thanks for watching. I hope that you learned something new and interesting here. If you did, please remember to like this video. If you enjoy learning about the Salem Witch Trials through my videos, you might also enjoy listening to the podcast Witch Hunt, which is produced by our team. Each episode breaks down the events of 1692 in depth and features original music. There's a link in the description box below. I'll see you again next time. This is Chapter 7. The Court of Oyer and Terminer. In May 1692, Massachusetts Governor Phipps established a special court to deal with the growing issue of witchcraft in the colony. This court would become infamous for its handling of the Salem Witch Trials. Let's get into it. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was established by order of Governor William Phipps on May 6. Its official name was the Court of Oyer and Terminer of all, and singular pleas, criminal and civil, which should be holden at or about the town of Salem. The court's origin is important because, although the Salem Witch Trials were the most well-known cases heard by this court, it actually had broader jurisdiction. This court was meant to deal with a range of issues, not just witchcraft. In fact, it was meant to deal with a backlog of cases in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that had been unable to be heard due to various circumstances, like perhaps there being no court session in a given year in one of the more remote parts of the colony, for example. So the judges who would hear these cases had far more on their plate than just accusations of witchcraft. But before we get into what they actually did, let's first talk about the three men who made up the court. The first judge on the bench was Judge Samuel Sewell. He was born in 1629 and died in 1709. And he was a man of some prominence in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a judge on the Court of Probate, and also served as Chief Justice of the Superior Court. He also wrote a diary, which, while largely uneventful, provides a lot of information about the day-to-day life of a Puritan in colonial America. His diaries have been published. They are a fascinating read. The next judge on the bench was William Stoughton. He was born around 1630 and died in 1686. He was a wealthy landowner in the town of Danvers and was one of the wealthiest men in Essex County, where Salem is located. He had little judicial experience prior to his appointment to this court. The third and final judge was John Hathorne. He was born in 1641 and died in 1701. He was a judge of probate in Salem and, like Sewell, had experience serving on other courts in the colony. These three judges, with their mixed bag of legal experience, were tasked with overseeing the trials of those accused of witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. One of the first trials held by the court was that of a woman named Bridget Bishop. She was accused of causing the death of a man named George Burroughs by means of witchcraft. Burroughs had been the minister of a church in the town of Salem for many years and was well respected by his congregation. However, a few months prior to his death, he had become increasingly erratic in his behavior. He began to have strange fits and convulsions, and his sermons became more and more disjointed. Eventually, he was no longer able to perform his duties as minister and was dismissed from his post. Soon after, he became ill and died. Now, this alone would not have been cause for suspicion of witchcraft. But Bridget Bishop had been seen arguing with Burroughs in the months prior to his death, and she had also been seen practicing witchcraft in other instances. For example, she had been accused of bewitching another man named John Proctor. So when Burroughs died, suspicion immediately fell on Bishop. She was arrested and brought before the court of Oyer and Terminer. The evidence against her was mostly circumstantial, but the judges found it sufficient to convict her. She was found guilty of the crime of witchcraft and sentenced to death by hanging. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop became the first person to be executed for witchcraft in the Salem Witch Trials. As we continue through the Salem Witch Trials, we will hear about many other people who were convicted and executed on the basis of similar kinds of evidence. Bridget Bishop's trial was just the beginning. Another major case that came before the court was the trial of Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse. These two women were tried together because they were accused of the same thing: the bewitching of a young girl named Abigail Williams. Sarah Good was a poor beggar who lived in the town of Salem. She was often seen as a nuisance because she would go door to door begging for food and money. She was also known to be a bit of a troublemaker. She was often involved in arguments and fights with other people in the town. Rebecca Nurse, on the other hand, was a highly respected member of the community. She was a God-fearing woman who was active in the church. She was also a well-to-do farmer and was considered to be one of the most honest and upright citizens in the town. So why then were these two women accused of the same crime? Well, it all has to do with Abigail Williams. Abigail was the niece of Reverend Parris, the minister of the church in Salem. She was a young girl who had a very vivid imagination. One day, while playing with some friends, she began to act out a story that she had heard about a woman who had been bewitched. Asaplayid began to scream and thrash about, and she accused Good and Nurse of trying to kill her with their witchcraft. Now, this is where things get a little complicated. There is some evidence that Sarah Good may have actually cursed Abigail Williams. There was a witness who came forward and said that he heard Good cursing the girl. However, there is no evidence that Rebecca Nurse had anything to do with the cursing of Abigail Williams. Despite this, both women were convicted on the basis of Abigail's testimony alone. Sarah Good was hanged on July 19th, 1692. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on October 19th, 1692. Now, I could go on telling you about the trials of people like George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Proctor, and many others, whose names you might recognize, but I think that's enough for now. I hope this gives you a good introduction to the court of Oyer and Terminer, and the role it played in the Salem Witch Trials. In the next episode, we will pick up where we left off and see how these trials continued to unfold. If you want more information about the court of Oyer and Terminer, or any of the people involved in these trials, I encourage you to check out the resources provided. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Until then, stay safe and happy haunting. Okay, so the last name I mentioned in that last segment was John Proctor. And of course, if you know anything about the Salem Witch Trials, you know that he was one of the most prominent victims of these trials. But there is some confusion about this man that I want to clear up. You see, there were actually two men named John Proctor. During this time period in colonial America, there was John Proctor, who was the minister of the church in Salem. And then there was John Proctor, who was the main character in Arthur Miller's play The Crucible. I mentioned John Proctor, the minister, in the last segment. But it was really John Proctor, the playwright, who was the most famous. And the reason for this is because Miller based his character, John Proctor, on John Proctor, the victim of the Salem Witch Trials. So when people talk about John Proctor, they are usually referring to the minister. But when they're talking about the character in the play, they will sometimes refer to him as John Proctor the Younger, to distinguish him from the minister. I just thought I would clear this up in case it causes any confusion. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this extra little bit of information. And if you liked this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Until then, stay safe and happy haunting. Chapter 8. Fear consumes mass. We left off last time with Reverend Samuel, Paris's daughter Elizabeth, claiming that she was being tormented by the devil, and that Tituba, Biba, and Sarah Good had come to her in the night and pressed their cold, clammy hands upon her body, causing her to fall into fits. This fits narrative, if we can call it that, would become the basis for hundreds of accusations over the next year and a half. And it's important to note here that while this initial story only involves 3 women, all 3 of them were immediately arrested, and then a 4th woman, Rebecca Nurse, was also taken into custody after Reverend Paris accused her of having a familiar spirit. Reverend Paris's daughter, Betty, meanwhile, remained in the care of her parents and other local ministers, presumably because they figured that she was too far gone to survive the winter in prison. Plus, they probably didn't want to be seen as persecuting a minister's daughter, so the authorities had 4 people in custody. But the story quickly grew to include many more. And when I say the story grew, I don't mean like a fungus or yeast, which are actually pretty cool. I mean it spread through gossip, rumor, and outright fear-mongering. In fact, the situation got so out of hand that some people started coming forward and saying that they, too, had been visited by witches. But there was one thing that set these accusations apart from those that came before. These new accusers weren't poor or marginalized. They were pillars of the community. A man named John Bailey, for instance, was a magistrate who served as judge at the Salem Court of Assistance. His wife, Anne, also known as Goody Bailey, claimed that on May she was in her garden when she heard a noise behind her, and turned just in time to see Martha Corey, a respected member of the community and wife of a well-to-do farmer, levitating through the air. As Goody Bailey recounted in her deposition, she went up higher, and then she turned about and beckoned to me with an angry look and flew away. Later, she would claim that she had also seen the spirit of Rebecca Nurse enter into her house. And so within days, 2 more prominent figures had been accused. But it wasn't enough for some people. Soon they wanted to see more arrests and more executions, and their wish would soon be granted. Because the very next day, on May, Elizabeth Hubbard, the daughter of a local minister, claimed that Martha Corey had flown through the air and caused her to fall into a fit. The court wasted no time in arresting her. They also took into custody the aforementioned Rebecca Nurse, as well as Sarah Wilds, another respected member of the community. Now, to be fair, Sarah Wilds was an elderly woman who lived alone and was somewhat of a gossip, but she was hardly the type of person who one would expect to be accused of witchcraft. Yet here she was, along with several others who had undone a day as bad in their lives. and they were thrown into prison based on the testimony of young girls who seemed to take great pleasure in accusing people without providing any kind of evidence. Now, some people have tried to explain these accusations away by saying that back in the 17th century, people believed that witches could fly. So it must have been perfectly reasonable for these women to accuse their neighbors of such things. But this is a gross misrepresentation of early American history. While European witches were often depicted as flying through the air, the idea of witches, sabbaths, broomsticks, and black cats didn't catch on in New England until after the Salem Witch Trials. In fact, when the accusations began in Salem, it was not uncommon for people to defend themselves by pointing out that there was no evidence that the accused person had ever attended a witch's sabbath or engaged in any other kind of witchcraft. That was until later. In other words, people did not accuse others of witchcraft because they believed that they could fly. They accused them of consorting with the devil, and that's an important distinction. The problem was that once the accusations started, they snowballed into a massive scandal. By June, the jails in Salem and Boston were filled to the brim with over 60 prisoners, and officials knew that they needed to do something fast. The governor at the time, Sir William Phips, created a special court of Oyer and Terminer to deal exclusively with cases of witchcraft, and he appointed 3 men to oversee it. Now, technically, this was supposed to be a court of law, but as we've discussed already, things were not going to be fair or balanced. For one thing, 2 of the 3 judges had been involved in previous witch prosecutions in England, so they went into the trials with a certain bias. And then there was the matter of the jury. Many of the jurors who had been summoned to serve were related to some of the accusers, or had business with some of the accusers. And of course, there was the small matter of the accusers themselves, who were allowed to sit in on the proceedings and heckle the accused. It was almost like a trial by combat, except instead of fighting each other, the accused were forced to fight the entire court system itself. So when the trials commenced in Salem in late June, it was clear that the accused had no chance of winning. The first person to go was Bridget Bishop, an unhappily married tavern owner who had been accused by several of the girls, including Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Williams, and Ann Putnam, Jr. The girls claimed that they saw her levitating through the air, and Bishop's lawyer simply called them liars. He argued that they had made up the whole thing, and that Bishop was innocent. But unfortunately for him, the jury didn't buy his argument. They found Bishop guilty and sentenced her to death. On July, she was hanged on Gallows Hill, becoming the first person executed for witchcraft in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, what happened next is going to sound crazy, but it gets worse. Before we move on, please consider leaving a comment below to tell us what you think of this series so far. Also, please subscribe and leave a like if you haven't done so already. Okay, now let's get back to the video. After Bishop's execution, the trials continued throughout the summer and fall, and as the months passed, the situation became increasingly dire. For one thing, more and more people were accused, including some of the most prominent figures in Salem, such as John Proctor, a wealthy landowner, and Reverend George Burroughs, a minister who had been ordained by the Massachusetts General Court. But perhaps even more disturbing was the fact that people who had nothing to do with Salem were also being dragged into the chaos. We've mentioned before how John Bailey and his wife, Anne, were visiting Salem when they witnessed Martha Corey levitating. Well, it turns out that John Bailey wasn't the only person to come forward with an outlandish story. Another man named John Manogue, who lived in the town of Andover, claimed that he had seen 3 witches flying through the air and that one of them, a woman named Margaret Scott, had cursed him. Meanwhile, in the town of Ipswich, a woman named Mary Esty claimed that she had seen 2 witches riding on a broomstick, and that one of them, a woman named Rebecca Easty, had been gossiping about her. Now, it is important to remember that none of these people had anything to do with the Salem Witch Trials. In fact, they were probably watching the proceedings with amusement until it became clear that they might be next. And before long, it was apparent that the accusations were spreading like wildfire. Just weeks after Maine and Estes made their accusations, over 150 people signed a deposition saying that they, too, had seen witches flying around and cursing them. Some of the accused were relatively obscure, but others were well known. One of the latter was Reverend George Burroughs. Burroughs had been accused by several of the girls, including Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Hubbard. According to them, They had seen him dancing with a group of witches at night. To make matters worse, Burroughs, his own wife, had accused him of witchcraft. When confronted with these charges, Burroughs tried to defend himself by pointing out that he had never been alone with any of the girls who accused him. But it didn't help. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On August, he was hanged on Gallows Hill, along with 8 others, bringing the total number of executions to 9. At this point, it seemed as though the madness was finally over. But then more people started getting accused. In October, a woman named Sarah Wilds, who had been in prison since July, died under mysterious circumstances. Her fellow prisoners claimed that she had been persecuted to death, but officials alleged that she had choked herself with a rope. Then in November, another prisoner named Martha Carrier died after drinking a potion that was meant to cure her ailments, but which actually killed her. The authorities, of course, blamed witchcraft, and that led to more accusations. In fact, things got so out of hand that at one point, a man named John Hawthorne had to flee to the woods to escape the crowd. He managed to hide there for several days until his brother, Increase, came to rescue him. And Evanton John Hawthorne was only able to escape because Increase distracted the mob by pretending that he, too, was a witch. Things continued in this vein for months, with people being accused and executed until the spring of 1693, when at last the trials came to an end. But that's gonna have to be in part 2. Part 2. Click here to continue to part 2, or click here to watch this video. As always, thanks for watching. Alright, children, it's time for bed. How about we read chapter 9? The executions begin. The sun rose on July 1692 over a New England village in chaos. On that day, the first woman to be tried for witchcraft in the Salem Witch Trials was to be executed. Her name was Bridget Bishop, and she had been found guilty just 3 days prior. Since her condemnation, she'd been locked up in a cell with 2 other women who were also awaiting their own trials, Rebecca Nurse and Susanna Martin. As dawn broke, all 3 women began to pray. Bridget was the first to be taken from the prison. She was awakened by 2 constables who came for her at about 5 o'clock in the morning. When they told her it was time to go, she sat up in bed and asked how she should dress. They told her to put on a black veil and a white apron. Then she was led out of her cell and down the stairs. When she got to the bottom of the stairs, a minister named Mr. Hawley asked her if he could pray with her. She replied, "I desire God Almighty to give me strength." And then she prayed for herself and for those who condemned her. Meanwhile, outside in the town square, a large crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. There were so many people there that it was impossible for Bridget to walk right into the center of the square. Instead, she was taken to one side, where an open space had been made between the jail and a nearby house. At these points, someone handed her a Bible and asked her if she would like to read something. She chose Psalm 35, verses 17, which says, "False witnesses did rise up, such as are not of this world. They gave me not peace, but said, Let him be put to death. Let us find him guilty of some fault. In spite of my integrity, they find no cause. But unto mischief doeth he now devise his way. They found out from themselves a wicked plot to bring me down to the low dungeon, the pit of destruction, and they have fallen in themselves into the midst of their own fictions. Yea, I will never forget this unto them that are ready to lie in wait. That hollow place do they dig for such as may fall in the midst of them." After reading these words, Bridget Bishop turned to face the crowd and made a speech. She said, "How dreadful must that place be, where not only the ministers of Satan are sent, but where men and women of God can come and join with them." Then Bridget raised her eyes toward heaven and uttered these prophetic words. "What a sad thing is it when persons stand in public and in the midst of much ado make long speeches, not knowing how soon their own particular doom may be past, that they shall shortly appear before the great judge where all must be revealed." Then, according to the official record of the proceedings, she said, my indictment being read over again, "I desire no other answer may be returned, but that I leave myself and my cause to God, the searcher of all hearts, and to his blessed judge, before whom we all must sometime appear." After she spoke, Bridget Bishop sang a hymn as a crowd watched, some moved to tears. Then she was led away to the gallows. Along the way, she stopped to pray at each of the 4 corners of the square, saying, O Lord, help me. For I am weak, my heart is sore. O Lord, help me, for I am weak, my heart is sore. At the gallows, she requested a ladder to reach the trapdoor, but was refused. When she stood up on the block, the noose was placed around her neck. She was left to wait for death. Eventually, the signal was given. The trapdoor opened, and Bridget Bishop died a martyr, proclaiming her innocence until her dying breath. But hers was not the only life snuffed out on that fateful day in July. After her execution, Rebecca Nurse and Susanna Martin were brought forward. Rebecca was elderly, and she walked slowly, leaning on her husband's arm. All along the way, she continued to pray audibly, as though in some trance. When her turn came, Rebecca was led up to the gallows, where she, too, denied the charges against her and spoke bravely to the assembled crowd. She said, "I am no more afraid of what they will do to me than a child is afraid of a 4th of July fire. It is a shame to have so many good people called together to the wickedness of such an occasion as this." With those words, Rebecca Nurse was strangled in front of dozens of screaming townspeople, and still the executions continued. Next up was Susanna Martin, who, like Rebecca Nurse, was old and infirm. Yet her spirit was strong, and she, too, denied the charges of witchcraft against her. But it seems that Susanna was somewhat overwhelmed by the events of that day. As she reached the gallows, she cried out, "O Lord, now, Lord, help me." And she begged to have the noose put around her neck instead of standing on the block. Her request was granted, and she became the 3rd victim to die on Gallows Hill that day. They weren't the last. 4 more people met their demise by hanging that day. One of them was John Willard, who was considered a leader of the male witches in Salem. He denied the charges of witchcraft, but he didn't deny them with the same fire that Rebecca Nurse and Bridget Bishop displayed. According to Reverend Paris, who kept careful records of these trials, Willard confessed his crimes while standing on the scaffold. Then he turned to the crowd and said, "My friends, I see a great alteration here. Somerunawai." Others hide their faces, but I have nothing to say. I am going to tell you a tale or to deliver a lecture. What I have said before, I say now. I know there are very few of you who would give your whole estate to have the least evidence of what I have said. If any person would give his whole estate to have seen half of what I have seen, I should say he had reason to give it. For I saw the very prince of the devils, how he shapes himself in divers forms and likeness, and brings his emissaries and imps, and those who do commit uncleanness. 10 aside, I cannot say any more than this. This is no place for such discourse. And with that he closed his eyes and awaited death. Martha Carrier was the next person to be hanged. Martha was another one of the witches who supposedly performed the devil's work. However, she didn't seem to accept her punishment so easily. While waiting her turn, Martha shouted curses at anyone who came near. She spat in people's faces, and she even threatened to have a revenge on the judge, Samuel Sewell, who sentenced her to death. Finally, when she was brought to the gallows, Martha cried out, "I am no witch. I am no witch." And when the noose was put around her neck, she fell to the ground in a faint. Later, when she was cut down, Martha's body was found to be dead, but there was no mark on her neck. It seemed that perhaps Martha Carrier's claims of innocence were true. George Burroughs was another man who proclaimed his innocence. Like Martha Carrier, he too was hanged and buried on Gallows Hill. George was a former minister who had been accused of casting spells on several members of the Putnam family. Before his execution, he pleaded with the court to allow him to write down his thoughts, so that he could clear his good name. But his pleas were ignored. When he was brought to the gallows, George offered up a prayer. He asked God to spare his young children. Then he, too, was strangled in front of the crowd. The last person to die in July 1692 was Alice Parker. Unlike the others, Alice did not maintain her innocence. In fact, as she was being led to the gallows, she sang a song of despair. "I must be gone, and you must live. No earthly power can hurt you more. I must be gone, and you must live. Lord, give to me. I humbly beg, an humble and a saving death." Once at the gallows, Alice confessed that she had indeed met the devil in the forest and pledged fealty to him. Then she went on to accuse several innocent townspeople of being witches. In the end, Alice was hanged, becoming the 9th victim of the Salem Witch Trials. That's all for tonight, children. Did you learn nothing? Well, don't just stand there arguing about that. That's all for tonight. Okay, fine. You want to argue? Go ahead. The night before the revolution started, there was a wedding feast in Boston. The bride and groom were members of the Orthodox Church, so they decided to celebrate their special day by giving their guests a taste of home. And what is a feast without dancing? But this was no time for merriment. The bride's father had been taken to jail for his role in the resistance. The groom's brother was gone, pressed into service in the British Army. Their friends and family were angry at the king's judges, who had just sentenced a fellow church member to death for stealing a loaf of bread, and all of them knew that they could easily be next. In fact, one of the men at the wedding feast was a judge's clerk, and he took it upon himself to remind everyone present that if they did unstop complaining about the court, they would end up right in jail with the rest of them. This was Chapter 9. And in Chapter 10, we will see how the community of New England spiraled into chaos. When we last saw Reverend Increase Mather, he was celebrating the acquittal of 2 young men accused of being witches. He had used his wits to poke holes in the prosecution's case, but it hadn't been easy. He had seen enough evidence of Satan's presence in Salem to know that witchcraft was real. And afterwards, he'd even spoken to some of the accused, trying to determine whether or not they were innocent. Now he was coming to the conclusion that most of them were, and if that was the case, then he needed to do something to stop the madness. Increase wrote a letter to the Massachusetts General Court, asking that they establish a panel of more experienced ministers to help determine the validity of the accusations in Salem. His letter was ignored. That was probably because the General Court was just as convinced of the reality of witchcraft as the Salem villagers. However, Increase didn't give up. Instead, he decided to speak directly to the people, and he wrote another letter, this one addressed to the churches in New England. Once again, he called for a group of experienced ministers to come to Salem and oversee the trials. This time, he got a response. Several ministers traveled to Salem to offer their assistance, and the results were immediate. The number of new accusations slowed down, and Increase was pleased to see that the courts were now taking a more cautious approach to these cases. But this wasn't the only change that was happening in Salem. Just days after Increase Mather arrived, the jail began filling up with prisoners. The accusations of witchcraft were now being met with a level of skepticism that the villagers were unaccustomed to, and as a result, more and more people decided to confess to witchcraft, rather than risk being sent to jail. Of course, this was seen as proof that Increase and the other ministers were wrong, but it also created a different kind of problem. The jails in New England were not designed to house large numbers of prisoners, and so they quickly became overcrowded. This led to terrible conditions and made it almost impossible for the prisoners to receive the care that they needed. To make matters worse, the people who confessed to witchcraft weren't just being held in jail, they were being held in the homes of their accusers. And when there were too many prisoners to go around, they had to travel from town to town, staying wherever they could find room. This meant that they were often separated from their families for weeks at a time and forced to sleep in barns, sheds, and public buildings. The prisoners were also forced to work long hours for their accusers, which meant that they had little time to rest or take care of themselves. It was during this time that many of them began to regret their confessions, some recanted hoping that it would improve their treatment. Others tried to escape, but no matter what they did, there was nowhere left for them to turn. The Salem jail was a small, dark place with barred windows and no ventilation. The prisoners slept on straw mattresses on the floor and were given only a thin blanket for warmth. They shared a single bucket for a toilet and were forced to stand in line for hours to get food or water. The guards were rough and unsympathetic, and they often beat the prisoners for minor infractions. The prisoners were crammed in so tightly that there was barely enough room to move. They were forced to walk over piles of waste, and the stench was so bad that many people became sick. All of this caused great pain for increased Mather. He had come to Salem to help the accused witches, but now he was watching as they suffered horribly in the jails. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and he didn't know what to do. As the months passed, things went from bad to worse. More and more people were arrested for witchcraft, and the jails became more and more overcrowded. The conditions were so bad that several prisoners died, and their bodies had to be left in the jail until their families came to claim them. This was more than Increase could bear. He began to question everything he had ever believed about witchcraft. Could it really be true that these people were possessed by the devil, or were they simply victims of circumstance? As the situation in Salem grew more chaotic, Increase began to hear rumors that the people were losing faith in the courts. Many of them felt that the judges were not impartial and that the trials were nothing more than a witch hunt. This worried Increase, because he knew that if the people lost faith in the judicial system, then there would be nothing to stop the madness. He had to do something to restore order to Salem, but he wasn't sure what that something was. Then one night, while Increase was visiting a friend in jail, he heard something that changed everything. One of the prisoners told him that she had been accused of witchcraft because she was different. She was a bigger, and the villagers were afraid of her. They accused her of being a witch, so that they could get rid of her. Increase was shocked. He couldn't believe that the people of Salem would accuse an innocent person of such a thing. But as he thought about it, he realized that this was exactly what was happening. The villagers were using the accusations of witchcraft as a way to get rid of people who were different. People who begged for money, or who were poor, or who simply didn't fit in. In Increase Mather's eyes, this was not the rule of law. This was mob rule, and mob rule could only lead to chaos. So Increase Mather wrote another letter, this time calling for the release of all the prisoners in Salem. He argued that the jails were so overcrowded that the prisoners could not receive a fair trial, and that the accusations were based on nothing more than fear and superstition. His letter was ignored. BT's point, no one in Massachusetts cared what Increase Mather thought. They were too busy pointing the finger of witchcraft at each other. It was at this point that Increase Mather gave up. He packed his bags and returned to Boston, where he continued his work as a minister. But he never forgot what he had seen in Salem. The experience had changed him, and he began to speak out against the persecution of witches whenever he could. Meanwhile, the chaos in Salem continued to grow. More and more people were accused of witchcraft, and the jails became more and more overcrowded. The situation was so bad that some of the prisoners had to be released early, even though they had not confessed. But when they were released, they were not free. The villagers continued to harass them, and they had to live in fear of being rearrested. As the months passed, it became clear that Salem would never be the same. The community had been torn apart by the accusations of witchcraft, and it would take years for them to recover. For some of the prisoners, recovery was not possible. They had been beaten, tortured, and imprisoned for so long that they were never the same again. Some of them died in prison, and others were executed. But for those who survived, life was still a nightmare. They were shunned by their families and friends, and they had to start over in a new town. Some of them were never able to find a place where they truly belonged, and for the rest of their lives, they lived in fear of being accused of witchcraft again. For Increase Mather, the story had a happier ending. He continued to serve as a minister in Boston for the rest of his life, and he was respected by all who knew him. However, he never forgot what he had seen in Salem, and he spent his entire ministry trying to prevent other communities from making the same mistakes. Hello everyone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the channel to learn about the dark history of New England. The Crucible, Chapter 11. The Turning Point. Doubt creeps in. In Chapter 10, we saw how quickly the trials were moving forward with little regard for the rights or safety of the accused. How the court accepted the testimony of children who claimed to see the devil at Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse's homes. And how, despite her good name, Rebecca Nurse was taken from her home in the middle of the night and imprisoned. By the end of chapter 10, doubt is beginning to creep into Abigail Williams's mind about testifying against Rebecca Nurse. But as this chapter opens, she is trying to convince herself that everything is fine because the devil can disguise himself as an angel of light. So it's not out of the ordinary for him to make his worshippers seem godly. She tells herself that Rebecca Nurse has confessed to being a witch, but this is another lie. Rebecca Nurse has done no such thing. But Abigail isn't the only one lying. In fact, most everyone is lying in this chapter. The first person we meet up with again is Reverend Paris, who's worried about what people are saying. He's worried that they're whispering and pointing and talking about him and his daughter. We know from previous chapters that there has been some question as to whether or not he and his daughter have been engaging in some sort of inappropriate relationship. And now, people are starting to wonder if maybe he made up the whole witchcraft thing to cover up his own sins. He's so concerned about what people are saying that he sends his servant, Mary Warren, to find out what's going on. Meanwhile, John Proctor goes to Salem to try and find his wife Elizabeth, who was also arrested in the middle of the night. While he's gone, his sister-in-law, Martha Corey, comes over to his house to warn him that his wife is in great distress and that Abigail Williams is accusing him and Elizabeth of being witches. Abigail Williams has accused Elizabeth of doing all sorts of things, including sticking a dagger in her heart. But perhaps the most distressing part of this is that Elizabeth is pregnant. And Abby says that Elizabeth stabbed her with a dagger while she was still inside her belly. That's right. According to Abigail, Elizabeth did magic while she was pregnant and stuck her with a magical dagger while she was still in the womb. This is so much nonsense, but there is nothing John Proctor can do about it except go to Salem and try and find his wife. When he finds her, he learns that she has been treated terribly and that Abigail Williams has lied about her and is planning to destroy her. At the jail, John Proctor meets with Judge Danforth and asks him why Elizabeth has been arrested and why she is being kept in jail. The judge says that she's been accused by Abigail Williams and several others of practicing witchcraft. John Proctor tries to tell the judge that Abigail Williams is a liar, but he won't listen because he doesn't want to hear anything negative about Abigail. Then John Proctor goes to see his wife. He tells her that Abigail Williams has lied about her and said that she cursed her and stabbed her with a dagger. Elizabeth responds by telling John Proctor that Abigail Williams must be put out of court because she is a liar. She tells him that the whole time he has been begging the court to believe him when he says Abigail Williams is a liar. He should have been telling them that she's a whore. Now, this is a turning point in the story, because this is the first time we see Elizabeth turn on Abigail Williams. Up until this moment, Abigail Williams has seemed untouchable. Everyone believes her. They think she's a sweet, innocent girl who wouldn't lie to them. But Elizabeth here tells John Proctor that she's actually a liar and a whore. And this gives John Proctor the idea to accuse Abigail Williams of lying about the other girls as well. We then see Reverend Hawley enter the courtroom, and immediately he begins to have doubts about the trial. When he entered the room, he heard the judge say that someone had come to him with a list of names. All respectable people whose reputations would be ruined if they were found guilty. These people include Governor Phipps's wife. You remember her from chapter 9, when she had a fit in church and fell down. She says she was bewitched by Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. And now she's saying that she was also bewitched by Rebecca Nurse. And Hawley is troubled by this because he knows these women and he knows their reputations. He thinks to himself, good and respected women, all of them charged with the same thing. This makes him begin to doubt the whole trial. Then he goes to talk to Judge Danforth, and he warns him that he is making a terrible mistake by not allowing John Proctor to speak to his wife. Danforth refuses to back down, though, and says that he won't allow Elizabeth Proctor to testify for her husband. He says, if the girl's a liar, she's a liar. If she's a whore, she's a whore. But she's not to be questioned here. This conversation between Reverend Hawley and Judge Danforth shows us two different ways of looking at the situation. Reverend Hawley has doubts. He sees the faults in the system. He sees the evidence, or lack thereof, and he sees the injustice of it all. But Judge Danforth is blinded by pride and power. He wants to uphold the law, but in doing so, he ignores all of the obvious problems with the trials. He refuses to acknowledge the possibility that the girls might be lying. He refuses to consider that maybe there aren't witches in Salem. And he especially refuses to admit that he might be wrong. Next, we see Cotton Mather enter the courtroom. He's the son of Increase Mather, who was also a minister and who begged his son not to get involved in the witchcraft trials because he feared it would end badly. But Cotton Mather wanted to be a part of the action. He wanted to help find the witches so he could save the town from harm. He even went as far as writing a book on how to identify witches. Now he stands before the court and tells them that there is something very important they need to consider. They need to make sure they don't rely too heavily on spectral evidence. What's spectral evidence, you ask? It's basically when a person says they saw the devil, but they didn't see him with their eyes. They only saw him with their minds. Cotton Mather warns the judges that it is dangerous to rely on this kind of evidence, because the human mind can be easily tricked by the devil. He says, "Men have been raised here beside me, who have made their whole religion to curse Christians, and that without any other evidence than the unsupported affirmation of a crazy woman." Here, Cotton Mather is suggesting that maybe some of these women who are claiming to see the devil might not actually be seeing him. Maybe their minds are playing tricks on them. Or maybe, just maybe, they're lying. After he says this, the judges dismiss court for the day, and when they come back the next day, they're gonna have to decide whether or not to accept this new information or ignore it. And guess what? Ignore it. Italiano. They refuse to consider the possibility that the girls might be lying, and they refuse to admit that they might be wrong. Instead, they move forward with the trials, and the rest of the story will show us how disastrous this decision turns out to be. Now let's think about the significance of the title of this chapter. The turning point. Doubt creeps in. Why do you think the author chose this as the title of the chapter? Well, the answer's pretty simple. This is the chapter where doubt creeps in. Up until this point, everyone has been certain that the girls are telling the truth. They believed everything they've said, and they've trusted their judgment implicitly. But in this chapter, we start to see doubt creep in. Ruberin, Ale Cotton Mather, and even Elizabeth Proctor begin to question the girl's story. They start to wonder if maybe they are lying. And this is significant because from this point on, the tone of the story changes. The mood becomes darker and more suspenseful. And we as readers begin to feel like things are not going to end well. So let's take a minute and think about the significance of doubt in this story. Why does doubt matter? Why is it so important that we allow ourselves to have doubts and to question what we believe to be true? Well, doubt allows us to think more clearly. It allows us to be more rational and logical, and it helps us to make better decisions. So in this story, when doubt creeps in, it's a good thing. It helps the characters to see the situation more clearly and to make better decisions. But unfortunately, most of them don't listen to their doubts. They refuse to allow themselves to be uncertain, and they end up making terrible mistakes. So I'll leave you with this. Don't be afraid to have doubts. Don't be afraid to question what you believe to be true. And don't be afraid to change your mind when new information comes to light. In a world that values certainty and conviction, it's easy to forget the importance of doubt. But as this story shows us, doubt can be a powerful tool if we know how to use it. Alright, that's all for this lesson. I hope it helped you to understand the Crucible a little bit better. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to keep watching. We've got lots of lessons on the Crucible, as well as other classic works of literature. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Alright, it's time to get caught up with the Salem Witch Trials. This is Chapter 12. The trials wound down. It's the year 1692 and Colonial Massachusetts is going through a very difficult time. Accusations of witchcraft are flying everywhere and people are being killed for being witches. But finally, things start to turn around. Finally, in October, Governor Phipps dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer. The court that has been overseeing all these trials. The court had become so corrupt and so ridiculous that even the governor had no choice but to step in and stop the madness. But before we get too excited about this, remember that the court of Oyer and Terminer was not dissolved because they were tired of executing innocent people. They were dissolved because they were causing political problems for Massachusetts. And if the court wasn't going to be fair, then Phipps wanted to make sure that he could have full control over what happened next. So, after all, it was his court. He just put two of his friends in charge of it. To replace this corrupt court, Phipps set up a new court with 3 judges. The first judge was John Danforth, who was an old, boring lawyer who only cared about money. The second judge was Samuel Sewell, who you might recognize from earlier episodes. He was a wealthy landowner, and also the guy who sentenced Martha Carrier to death. And the third judge was William Stoughton, who at this point in the story is probably one of the most hated men in Salem. Stoughton was a judge who relished in his power. He did everything he could to convince people to plead guilty. And then he used their confessions as proof of their guilt. These 3 judges oversaw the last 5 trials of the Salem Witch Trials. And while they didn't completely end the hysteria, they did do one very important thing. They refused to accept spectral evidence. Now, technically, Phipps had already outlawed spectral evidence in September, but until now, that law only applied to cases that were ongoing. These judges made it clear that spectral evidence would not be allowed in any case, which meant that there was no longer any way to prove guilt. So, let's see how this went. The first person brought to trial was George Burroughs. If you remember him, he was the minister who was accused by a group of young girls after they got kicked out of his church. During his trial, Burroughs tried to argue that since he was a minister, it would be ridiculous for him to be a witch. He also argued that, since he was always busy preaching, there was no way he could have done all those evil things that they were accusing him of. Unfortunately for Burroughs, though, these arguments didn't work, even though he had respectable references and plenty of alibis. The prosecution argued that witches can easily fool people into thinking they re somewhere else, when really they re off doing evil stuff. It was also pretty easy for them to argue that, well, maybe God was trying to test his faith or something. Burroughs was found guilty, and he was hanged on August 19th, 1692. Next up was Martha Carrier. Now, this one's a little weird because there was never any real evidence against her. She had no known enemies. No one had ever seen her do anything evil, and she didn't even fit the profile of a typical witch. She was a poor farmer with a reputation for being mean. And really, that was about it. The only reason she was accused was because one girl said she saw Martha in a dream. That's it. Not a very strong piece of evidence. Of course, the court agreed, and she became the first person acquitted by this court on October 1692. After that, they tried Alice Parker. She was a homeless bigger woman who had been living in Salem for some time, and once again, the only evidence against her was spectral. She claimed that she was innocent, but she also claimed that she couldn't read or write, so she couldn't possibly have signed a confession that was presented as evidence against her. Well, the judges ruled that since she couldn't read or write, she could not have signed the confession, and therefore it must have been a forgery. She was acquitted on October 29th, 1692. On November, the court tried a man named John Proctor. Remember him? He was Elizabeth Proctor's brother, and he admitted to being a witch. He actually confessed to a ton of crimes, including raping a woman named Mary St. But even though his confession was a little detailed, the judges threw it out because they said it was probably coerced. They also dismissed the testimony of the girls who said they saw him practicing witchcraft. They decided that even though he had confessed, there was no way to know whether he was telling the truth or not. So he was acquitted on November. The next day, they tried Elizabeth Howe. She had originally been accused back in June, but at the time, she was pregnant. So they told the court they'd wait till after she gave birth. But now that she was acquitted, they brought her to trial anyway. She denied being a witch, and the judges believed her. She was free to go. Then they tried Susanna Martin. She had originally been accused by a girl named Elizabeth Hubbard, who said she saw her levitating, and that was really about it. When it came time for the trial, Elizabeth was asked to describe what she saw that night, but she said that she could not identify any of the witches in the room. So, with no real evidence against her, she was acquitted on November. Finally, on November they tried Margaret Scott. Like many of the other women in this episode, she was an elderly beggar woman with a bad reputation. The girls accused her of hurting them with a ball made of lead and nails, and she apparently confessed to it. But the judges threw out her confession because it was coerced. They also threw out the testimony of the girls who said they saw her cursing people. With no evidence against her, she was acquitted. All in all, these were the last trials of the Salem Witch Trials. 9 people had been executed since the new court took over, and none of them were women. In fact, every single person the new court oversaw was acquitted. In hindsight, we can say that this was obviously the right thing to do. But at the time, there was still a lot of pressure to convict. The governor specifically told these judges that they needed to find these women guilty, because if they did ante, people would say that they were letting the witches win. So these judges really had a tough job. They had to do the right thing, even though it was risking their own reputations, and they weren't the only ones. When Martha Carrier was acquitted, the governor told the court that he was disappointed. He thought they should have convicted her. But by the end of the trials, even he had to admit that they were right. There was no way to prove these accusations. And the best thing to do was just let these women go. But the question is, why? Why did it take so long for people to realize that this was the best option? You see, in order for this to happen, you need to have some common sense. And where was the common sense? Why did it take so long for the leaders of Massachusetts to use their brains and realize what was happening here? Well, some historians believe that it was on so much that they lacked common sense as it was that they lacked the courage to do the right thing. Ever since the beginning, these trials were more about politics than they were about justice. People were accused based on popularity, not evidence. And at the end of the day, that's what was at stake. For example, when Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, it was because he realized that he would lose the election if he didn't. He needed to make people happy, and the way to do that was to appease the townspeople of Salem. And when he sent his friends to run the new court, it was because he needed to keep control of the situation. If the trials went on any longer, then things could get out of hand. So he needed to make them short and sweet. And that's what these judges did. They didn't care about these women or about justice. They just wanted to get it over with. Now, fortunately for us, this seems to have worked. After the last trial ended on November 29, 1692, no one else was executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts, and eventually most of the surviving prisoners were given compensation for being wrongfully accused. But unfortunately, not everyone got that memo. For example, in 1712, an old woman named Rebecca Nurse was accused of being a witch, and she was killed for it. And that was 20 years after the Salem Witch Trials ended. This entire event was a huge mistake. Innocent people were accused and executed. Families were torn apart, and the entire community was torn to shreds. And while there's no way to undo all of that, I guess it's nice to know that this type of thing doesn't really happen anymore. At least not in the United States. But unfortunately, this isn't the end of the story. We still have to talk about what happened after all this was over. So stay tuned for Chapter 13, Aftermath. See you next time. Chapter 13, Aftermath and Regret. On September 22, 1697, Governor Phipps issued a proclamation ordering that all remaining prisoners be freed. For Giles Corey, John Proctor, and Martha Carrier, it was too late. Tay, wary dead, but their families now had to pick up the pieces and move forward with their lives, knowing that their loved one had been put to death for a crime that was not real. For some of the accused, the road to recovery was long and difficult. Rebecca Nuss was one of the more respected members of the community, and her reputation was tarnished by her supposed transgressions. After her release from prison, she was shunned by many of the people she had known all her life. She died in 1706, never fully recovering from the ordeal. Then there was Sarah Good, who, along with Sarah Osborne, was accused of being a witch because they were poor and homeless. They couldn't make their own defense, and no one was willing to come to their aid. Sarah Good died in prison, but Sarah Osborne survived. She was released after serving 5 years and spent her remaining days trying to earn money so she could buy her freedom. She died in 1706. Some of the accused tried to recover financially by suing those who had accused them. In 1698, Elizabeth Howe sued John Alden, who had accused her of witchcraft. Alden refused to apologize or pay damages, and even brought more charges against her. The case went to court, where Elizabeth's husband testified that his wife was innocent. However, the jury sided with Alden and ordered that Elizabeth pay him £20. This was the only financial award granted to an accuser. Most other civil cases were either dismissed or resulted in settlements out of court. There were also criminal trials. Reverend Paris, who had lost his eyesight during the hysteria, sued John Proctor for accusing him of fraud. He won the case, and Proctor was ordered to pay him £20. He also sued George Burroughs, who had accused him of being a witch. Burroughs denied the charges and claimed that he was insane, but he lost the case and was ordered to pay Paris £500. Paris never collected any of the money owed to him. In October 1697, Judge Sewell published a public confession of his guilt in the Boston Newsletter. He admitted that he had presided over the trials without allowing the prisoners adequate representation, and that he had accepted evidence that was based on lies. He begged for forgiveness and promised to devote the rest of his life to making amends. Sewell was one of the judges who sentenced Proctor to death. He continued to serve as a judge until 1700 and then retired to his farm, where he lived out the remainder of his life. Most of the other judges and magistrates refused to admit any wrongdoing. They were all concerned with their own reputations and didn't want to be associated with the Salem Witch Trials. They knew that they had made mistakes, but they believed that their actions were necessary to protect the community from the threat of witchcraft. Some of them even went so far as to claim that the trials were fair and that the prisoners had received due process. The story doesn't end there. We don't know what happened to all of the accused witches, but we do know that the Salem Witch Trials had a lasting impact on the town and its people. The families of those who were accused and killed were never able to fully recover. They were haunted by the ordeal for generations to come. Martha Corey's son-in-law, Thomas Danforth, wrote a letter to the Massachusetts General Court asking for compensation for his family. He claimed that they had suffered great losses both financially and emotionally because of the witch trials. The court agreed to pay the family £40, but this was not nearly enough to make up for the loss of Martha's life. Giles Corey's widow, Martha, was awarded £100 for the loss of her husband and the pain and suffering he endured. His son, John, received £50 for the loss of his father's estate, and another £50 for his father's pain and suffering. These payments were meant to compensate the family for their financial losses and help them to move on with their lives, but they were never able to forget what had happened to their father and husband. John Proctor's widow, Elizabeth, was awarded £200 for the loss of her husband. Their children received £100 each for their loss of inheritance, but these payments did not bring back their father or heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon them. Some of the families tried to put the past behind them and move on with their lives, but others were consumed by the tragedy and spent their days searching for answers. They wanted to know why their loved ones had been accused and how the trials had been allowed to go so far. One of the most haunting stories is that of Samuel Wardwell, who was accused of attending the Devil's Sabbath and having sexual relations with the devil. He confessed to these charges and implicated several other people in his testimony. He was released in 1698, but he was never able to shake the belief that he was a witch. He became depressed and eventually took his own life. The Salem Witch Trials were one of the darkest chapters in American history. They were a time when fear and paranoia caused people to turn on each other and accuse their neighbors of being witches. The trials resulted in the deaths of 20 innocent people and left many others with physical and emotional scars. The families of the accused were never able to fully recover. They were haunted by the ordeal for generations to come. In the years since the Salem Witch Trials, people have wondered why they happened and how they could have been prevented. Historians have offered a number of theories, but no one knows for sure what caused the hysteria. Some believe that it was the result of religious extremism and the fear of the devil. Others believe that it was caused by social and economic tensions in the community. Still, others believe that it was a combination of factors that led to the perfect storm. What we do know is that the Salem Witch Trials were a tragedy. They were a time when people were accused of crimes they did not commit and punished severely. The accused were not given a fair trial, and their pleas of innocence were ignored. The trials resulted in the deaths of 20 innocent people and left many others with physical and emotional scars. The families of the accused were never able to fully recover. They were haunted by the ordeal for generations to come. It is important to remember the victims of the Salem Witch Trials and learn from the mistakes of the past. It is also important to remember the families of the accused and the impact that the trials had on them. The Salem Witch Trials were a dark chapter in American history, but they are a reminder of the importance of justice and fairness. We must ensure that such atrocities never repeat themselves. Now let's talk about the characters in Chapter 3. Judge Samuel Sewell, the only judge who admitted guilt, apologized publicly and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. Rebecca Norse, one of the more respected members of the community, was shunned by many after her release and died believing she had done something wrong. Sarah Good, one of the 2 homeless women accused of witchcraft, died in prison. Sarah Osborne, the other homeless woman accused of witchcraft, was released after 5 years and spent her remaining days trying to earn money to buy her freedom. She died believing she was a witch. Elizabeth Howe, accused of witchcraft because of her relationship with Sarah Good, sued John Alden for defamation but lost the case. She died believing she was a witch. George Burroughs, accused of being a witch, testified that he was insane and should not be held responsible for his actions. He lost his case against Reverend Paris and died believing he was a witch. Thomas Danforth, Martha Corey's, petitioned the court for compensation for the loss of Martha and received £100. Martha Corey Giles, Corey's widow, petitioned the court for compensation for the loss of Giles and received £100. John Proctor, son of Giles Corey, petitioned the court for compensation for the loss of his father and received £50. Reverend Paris, the minister whose daughter was one of the first accusers, sued John Proctor and George Burroughs for defamation, but never collected the money owed to him. Samuel Wardwell, accused of being a witch and testifying against others, died by suicide, believing he was a witch. These are the main characters in Chapter 13. If you want to learn more about the Salem Witch Trials, stay tuned for more updates. Thank you for watching. Well, Unit 3, you've made it this far, and we're going to finish the colonial period with one last thing. We're going to wrap it up with a bang. So we're going to talk about the Salem Witch Trials. This is Chapter 14, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials. And if you're ready to get them bring cow's milk, then let's get to it. Okay, so what are we doing talking about the Salem Witch Trials? You're probably asking yourself, well, as we've been doing all along, we're looking for the big takeaways that will help us understand the development of American society. And that means at the end of each chapter, we're going to identify a turning point, and we're going to look at a set of AP government terms. And then finally, we're going to answer our big essay question for the unit. So let's begin with the turning point. What was the turning point of this period? It was the conclusion of the Salem Witch Trials. And don't worry if you don't remember the Salem Witch Trials. Don't worry, I got you. Here's a review. From 1692 to 1693, a group of young women began having fits that were interpreted as evidence of witchcraft, and they accused several local women of practicing witchcraft. And they were tried in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In fact, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and 20 were killed before the trials ended. Okay, so why is this a turning point? Well, first of all, this event had an immediate impact on American thought and American legal proceedings, because after this event, there were calls for reform in the legal system. Specifically, people started demanding tangible evidence, which led to a decline in the use of spectral evidence, which is basically when someone says that they saw the defendant at a witch-ass Sabbath, or they saw the devil or whatever, but they never actually saw the crime itself. For example, you could accuse me of being a witch because my left eyelid droops slightly downwards, which is apparently a sign of witchcraft. That's called spectral evidence. That's not good enough. People started saying after this, you need tangible evidence. Also, judges demanded stronger corroborating evidence before they would convict someone of a crime. In addition, the whole episode of the Salem Witch Trials was used by Enlightenment thinkers, both here in America and abroad, to criticize religion and superstition. So here's a question for you. Remember our conversation about the tension between reason and religion that we've been seeing throughout this course? How did the Salem Witch Trials contribute to that tension? Well, one of the big ideas that emerged out of this whole thing is that reason is superior to religion. And that was not an argument that was lost on people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. The Salem Witch Trials also contributed to a sort of anti-authoritarian sentiment here in America. That is because the trials were overseen by local magistrates who were appointed by the government and supported by the Puritan leaders in Massachusetts Bay. And so any challenge to the government's authority or the Puritan leaders was squashed. In other words, there was no separation of church and state, and that was a problem. And then lastly, the Salem Witch Trials became a part of American literature. And you can see this especially in The Crucible, written by Arthur Miller in 1953. The play uses the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for the McCarthy hearings. If you're not familiar with that, go read some Unit 6, Unit 7, Unit 8. But anyway, he uses the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory to attack the practice of accusing people of disloyalty without any actual evidence. Alright, now let's talk about how we might use this in answering our big essay question for this unit. Remember that our big essay question is, how did the geographic, economic, and political characteristics of colonial America shape the development of the United States? Okay, so let's see what we can do here. Well, as we just discussed, The Salem Witch Trials were partly the result of the religious beliefs of the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts Bay. They were a very strict group of Protestants who believed that the devil was alive and well in New England, and they needed to be constantly on the lookout for him. Adityonagi, the political and economic characteristics of the colonies, also played a role. For example, the Salem Witch Trials took place at a time when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was economically struggling. The fur trade was disappearing and the colony was having trouble finding new sources of wealth. In addition, there was a lot of social tension in the colony due to the growing population and the increasing number of people who were questioning the authority of the Puritan leaders. So to restate this more formally, the religious goals of the Puritans, the economic struggles of the colony, and the political tensions that existed in the Massachusetts Bay Colony all contributed to the Salem Witch Trials. Okay, now let's turn to our third and final task in this video, which is to look at those AP government terms. And we'll start with the definition. A system of government in which the right to rule is based on religious authority. Now, how does this term relate to what we're studying? Well, the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay established a theocracy. When they created a system of government that was run by religious leaders, the leaders of the colony believed that God had chosen them to establish a community in the New World based on their own interpretation of His Word. And so they created laws and policies that reflected their religious beliefs. For example, they passed laws against gambling, drinking, and even dancing, which they saw as sinful behavior. They also established a system of education that was run by the church. Now, the second term we'll look at is civil disobedience. So the definition of civil disobedience is the refusal to obey unjust laws or regulations, especially as a peaceful form of protest. Now, how does this term relate to what we're studying? Well, civil disobedience is most closely associated with Henry David Thoreau, who refused to pay a poll tax that he believed was being used to support a government that was run by religious leaders. He said, quote, "The only obligation which I have a right to resist is the obligation to be obedient to an unjust law. To an unrighteous law is resistance to that which is right, which is in itself the highest right." And that's from his essay, Civil Disobedience. So that's where we get the term from. Okay, the third term we'll look at is natural rights. And the definition is this: the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, how does this term relate to what we're studying? Well, John Locke argued that these rights were given to people by their creator, and that the government's job was to protect those rights. Now, this idea had a profound impact on the development of the American colonies. For example, the idea of natural rights was one of the main arguments that the colonists used to justify their break with Great Britain. They argued that the British government was violating their natural rights by taxing them without representation. And they also used the idea of natural rights to justify their rebellion against the British. In other words, they had a right to overthrow a government that was violating their rights. And then lastly, let's look at republicanism. So the definition is a political ideology that emphasizes the importance of the rule of law, the protection of property, and the common good. And how does this term relate to what we're studying? Well, republicanism was one of the dominant political ideologies in the American colonies. In fact, many of the colonists were members of political groups that were dedicated to Republican ideals. These groups organized themselves into local chapters, and they published newspapers and pamphlets that spread their ideas to the general public. They even held secret meetings where they discussed plans for the future of the colonies. And ultimately, these Republican ideals helped to inspire the American Revolution. Okay, so those are our terms, and now we can go back to our big essay question and put it all together by arguing that the geographic, economic, and political characteristics of colonial America shaped the development of the United States. And then finally, let us think about how we might use this in answering one of the long essay questions on the AP exam. Here's a possible prompt. To what extent did changes in the relationship between humans and the natural world during the period 1492 to 1754 transform societies? Whoa, that's a big question. Let's break it down. Well, one way to answer this question would be to argue that the discovery of the Americas in 1492 and the subsequent colonization of the continent by Europeans had a profound impact on the relationship between humans and the natural world. You could then go on to explain that the colonists exploited the resources of the land and displaced or enslaved the native populations, which led to significant environmental and social changes. Okay, I hope that helps. If you want even more help, click right over here and grab a view packet. There's a link right there. I've got videos on everything you're going to learn in a push. And if you want me to keep making these videos, then by all means subscribe. Now that the sun has set and the moon and stars are out, it's time to return to our story. We've had traveled through time and followed the Salem Witch Trials from their shocking beginnings all the way to their tragic end. Now it's time to return to the present day, to see what remains of Salem Village, otherwise known as Danvers. Here we are in present-day Salem. I can't believe our journey through time is over. I hope you enjoyed visiting Salem in 1692 and seeing the witch trials firsthand. But if you did, please remember to hit the like button. That really helps us keep making more time travel videos for you. And while you're at it, why not subscribe so you don't miss any of our new adventures? Before we go, I'd like to take one last trip down memory lane and revisit some of the most important people we met along the way. We'll start with Reverend Paris. He was the minister of Salem Village, where the story of the Crucible is set. During the witch trials, he was one of the first men to accuse his parishioners of witchcraft. Many believe that his accusations were motivated by greed, power, and revenge. In T's house, Reverend Paris lived during the time of the Salem Witch Trials. It still stands today and is open to the public for tours. When we visited, we also met his daughter, Abigail Williams. She was one of the young girls who started the hysteria by accusing others of witchcraft. She was also one of the main accusers throughout the trials. What happened to her after the trials is unknown, but it is believed that she moved away and changed her name to avoid being recognized. Another person we met was Judge Samuel Su. He was one of the judges who presided over the Salem Witch Trials. He was responsible for many of the unjust convictions that resulted in the executions of 20 innocent people. After the trials, he became one of their most vocal critics and spent his remaining years trying to make amends for his role in the tragedy. You can read his thoughts in his personal diary, which is available to read online. The next person we should meet is John Proctor. He was one of the men accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials. He was a strong, independent man who refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. In the end, he was hanged, but his death helped bring an end to the witch trials. This is where John Proctor lived during the time of the Salem Witch Trials. Today, the house is known as the Proctor Memorial and is open to the public for tours. The last person we should visit is Reverend Halley. He was a minister who came to Salem to help with the witch trials. At first, he supported them, but soon became convinced that the accusations were false and tried to stop them. He ended up leaving Salem and becoming a critic of the witch trials. These are just a few of the people we met on our journey through time. Each one played an important role in the Salem Witch Trials, and each one helps us understand this dark chapter in American history. But now, it's time to say goodbye. As we leave Salem, I want to share one last thought with you. History is full of mistakes, some bigger than others. The Salem Witch Trials are one of the darkest chapters in American history, but they also offer us an important lesson in compassion and reason. If we learn from history, we can work to make sure that such tragedies never repeat themselves. I hope you enjoyed your time traveling with us to Salem. Even though our journey's coming to an end, the lessons we learned here will stay with us forever. So take a moment to look up at the stars and reflect on everything we've seen and heard. Let the beauty of the night sky remind you that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. Imagine the vastness of space stretching out before you, filled with twinkling stars and distant galaxies. Each star is like a tiny spark of light, offering a moment of peace and tranquility in the darkness. As you gaze up at the night sky, let your thoughts drift to everything we've experienced together. Remember the bravery of those who fought for justice and the resilience of those who endured hardship. Let the starlight reflect the strength and courage that you carry within you. Now close your eyes and picture yourself surrounded by the peaceful darkness. Let the soft glow of starlight fill your dreams, carrying you to a place of rest and relaxation. Feel the weight of the day melt away as you drift into a deep and restful sleep. As you drift into peaceful rest, know that even the darkest chapters of history hold lessons that can guide us towards a brighter future. The Salem Witch Trials may have been a time of fear and injustice, but they also teach us the importance of compassion. understanding, and standing up for what is right. As you dream, let these lessons weave their way into your subconscious, reminding you that even in the face of adversity, hope and humanity can endure. So go now, dear traveler, and carry the starlight within you. May it be a beacon of hope, a reminder of strength, and a symbol of the endless possibilities that await you in the darkness. Until we meet again, may the stars guide you, the moon protect you, and the dawn bring you new hope. And remember, even in the darkest of nights, the stars shine brightest. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the Salem Witch Trials and the events that unfolded in Salem Village. If you're still with us, we have a special treat for you. There's a hidden message in this video, one that holds a special meaning for those who've made it to the end. It's a small detail, a subtle nod to the enduring spirit of Salem. Can you spot it? Pause the video and take a close look. What do you see? It's a simple image, yet one that symbolizes the strength and resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. In the heart of the video, we hid an image of a single candle flame flickering in the darkness. It's a small detail, but one that carries a powerful message. The candle flame represents the enduring spirit of Salem, the unwavering hope that guided those who endured the darkest days of the witch trials. Just as a single flame can pierce the darkness, the people of Salem found the strength to overcome their challenges and rebuild their lives. We hope this small detail has resonated with you, reminding you that even in the darkest of times, hope and resilience can prevail. It is a tribute to the strength of the human spirit and a celebration of the enduring legacy of Salem. If you've made it this far, we thank you for your support and your passion for history. Your enthusiasm inspires us to continue bringing these immersive time travel experiences to life. Keep an eye out for more hidden messages in our upcoming adventures. Who knows what other secrets we might reveal?